We've come to that time already, our last specialist speaker. Perhaps needs less introduction to many of you than most. Dr. Michael Irwin, who was twice former chair of the Voluntary Euthanasia Society, now known as Dignity in Dying, former medical director of the United Nations. Michael and I first met when I took over from Michael 10 years ago as coordinator of the Secular Medical Forum, the SMF, which Michael founded initially as a separate entity from the NSS. Michael suggested to me that a couple of hours a week might do the job. It's not quite how it panned out, Michael. But I thank you for not scaring me off at the outset at the enormity of the task. So Michael's now involved in My Death, My Decision, and has assisted several people to Dignitas in Switzerland, and will now address the question, when will Mars, medically assisted rational suicide, land on the UK?
I hope my voice will hold up, because I've had a bad cold the last few days and I was quite hoarse this morning. But I must first of all, though, kind of say that you have done a wonderful job, Anthony, in the way you have developed the Secular Medical Forum. And I'm most grateful to you. When we had that conversation, you say 10 years ago, I do remember saying it might take only a couple of hours a week or so, and I apologize for that. But you've been a wonderful person in what you've done, and here is proof of it in the room this afternoon. So when will Mars arrive on the UK? It was back in 1996. I was on the Radio 4 Moral Maze programme. I was then chairman of the Voluntary Euthanasia Society. And Michael Burke asked me, when will it happen? And I said, in about 10 years. Now, 20 years later, in June of 2016, I was back on the Moral Maze. Michael Burke was still there. And he reminded me that I'd said about 10 years, something like 20 years ago. What's gone wrong? Well, Jackie has given you many reasons for what's gone wrong or what hasn't happened yet. But in my mind, it is a rolling 10 years. And that's what I think will happen. Now, I agree much of what Jackie has said, although I think you did say that I was not so much in favour of the Oregon bill. I'm very much in favour of the Oregon bill, but as a start. It should go much further. The major opponent, of course, is religion. And I can remember when Lord Joffre, Joel Joffre, who was a very close friend of mine, when he was in the House of Lords back in 2006, introducing a bill very much like the Faulkner bill, and he said then that the main opposition he had was from the Roman Catholic Church, led by the Archbishop of Cardiff, a man called Peter Smith. But what was more surprising was that the National Right to Life Committee in America provided much of the money to help the Roman Catholic Church at that time. The medical establishment, Jackie has touched on that as a possible opponent, but I can remember being at the annual conference in 2005, when on the very last day of the conference, most of the traditional attendees at that conference had already left on the last day, gone off to play golf and so on, and we got through a motion that the BMA would adopt a neutral position on changing the law. Unfortunately, the year later, under pressure from the Christian Medical Fellowship, that position was reversed. But having mentioned that, the Royal College of Nursing has adopted a neutral position since 2009 and still has maintained that. So that's one good example of a medical institution which wants to say, well, if the Parliament changes the law, we will be willing to accept it. A brief bit of history to show how times have changed. The Voluntary Euthanasia Society, now called Dignity in Dying, was the first right to die society in the world, established back in 1935 by two main groups. A group of doctors, led by Lord Monaghan, the President of Royal College of Surgeons, and a group of clergy, Canon Dick Shepherd of St Martin in the Fields in London. And they were two leading people in the formation of VES. And the very first public meeting of VES took place at the headquarters of the British Medical Association on December the 10th, 1936. A question: why is December the 10th so important? It's Human Rights Day. It wasn't in those days. That happened, of course, after the Second World War. But that became, that to me is a very symbolic date, December the 10th, 1936. The BMA House hosting a discussion on this, and now that is Human Rights Day. Jackie touched on the degree of public support in the region of 75-80%, but it's not a rock solid 75%. If you only ask three questions, do you agree to change in the law, you don't agree, or you don't know, then you get 75% plus. But if you ask five questions, do you strongly agree in changing the law, only about 50% will say yes. Do you tend to agree to change the law, you get 25% saying agree. So it's not a rock solid figure, and unfortunately many politicians play upon that fact. Another big problem, I think, is the definition of what is terminal illness. The General Medical Council, their document, End of Life Care, talks about someone dying in the next 12 months. The Scottish Government, just a few months ago in July, revised its Social Security Act, which made no reference to how long terminal illness would be. And in the debates in the House of Lords, Lord Faulkner's bill, in the House of Commons, Rob Barris's bill, a lot of time was wasted in the opponents saying, well, how can doctors determine who is terminally ill? Now, as Jackie has said, that's based upon the Oregon model, a very good model indeed. But even in Oregon, they are now uneasy about that 6-month criteria. And in February next year, there will be a debate in their state assembly to expand that act to include persons with serious degenerative diseases. And you referred to the Canadian law passed 2 years ago. They didn't follow the Oregon model, fortunately. They didn't limit it to the terminally ill, but they said to include grievous, irreversible medical conditions. And Spain, more recently, there's a debate going on right now in the Spanish Parliament where they will talk about a bill, a law, for a serious and terminal illness or a chronic severe disability. Excuse me, my mouth's going quite dry. Now, another thing to remember is that euthanasia is happening already in this country. Professor Clive Seal of London University did 2 surveys in 2004 and 2008 involving almost 4,000 doctors, which showed that there were at least 1,000 deaths a year due to voluntary euthanasia and 2,000 deaths a year due to non-voluntary euthanasia. Unfortunately, it often happens when people have private doctors. You won't find many rich people dying in hospices nowadays. Anyway, those results of those surveys were so reliable that they were printed in the magazine Palliative Medicine in April 2009. So it's happening already in this country. So I always say, well, why not legalize what is already happening? Now, I don't want to sound too callous, but we all know about Noel Conway, who is not yet terminally ill, but pretty close to it. He has to rely upon oxygen, I think about 20 hours a day. He has motor neuron disease. And you could argue, this is where the palliative care people will say, well, Noel Conway can stop relying on his oxygen, and then his palliative care doctors will have to take care of the symptoms, respiratory distress, and so on, and put him into continuous deep sedation. That may take several days. Of course, it would be much nicer for Noel if he had a chance to take, say, a pill or swallow some liquid and die quickly. But that is the way that people who are terminally ill can be helped to die. And I always feel the expression assisted dying is basically an expression for good palliative care. Now, Noel Conway's case will be going to the Supreme Court very soon. The last time it was discussed in the Supreme Court in 2014, the President then, Lord Neuberger, said, quote, "Quite apart from the notorious difficulty in assessing life expectancy, even for the terminally ill, there seems to me to be more justification in assisting people to die if they have the prospect of living for many years a life that they regard as valueless, miserable, and often painful, than if they have only a few months left to live." Lady Hale is now the president of the Supreme Court. Maybe I shouldn't say this in this gathering, but I remember talking to her a few years ago at a NSS lunch, and I know that she's in complete agreement with what her predecessor feels about this. So back to the question, when will the law possibly change? I believe that there'd be a better chance of getting a change in the law if we didn't limit ourselves to talking about the Oregon model, but focused on what has happened in Canada. After all, better to copy a Commonwealth country than an American state, perhaps. What happened in Western Europe, in the Netherlands, in Belgium. And to me, the best example of good right-to-die law is what the Belgians are doing. That is, it's integrated, voluntary euthanasia, integrated into their excellent palliative care system. Another important area I think about is people with dementia. Now, in the early stages of dementia, you still have sufficient mental competence, if you wish to do so, to go to Switzerland and have a doctor-assisted suicide there at Dignitas. If the law were to change here to legalize medical-assisted dying, then people with dementia in the early stages could perhaps get that particular advantage and not have to go through the agonizing development of that awful disease. But that means you've got to think about people who are not only terminally ill. Now, the Secular Medical Forum presently limits itself to campaigning to change the law for the terminally ill. I'd like to quote 3 other organizations in this country that go beyond that. Friends of the End, based in Glasgow, campaigning body to try and change the law in Scotland. And it may be possible that the law might change in the Scottish Parliament before it will change in the Westminster Parliament. But anyway, their objective is, they say, medically assisted dying should be available to all competent adults with either a terminal illness or an incurable condition causing hopeless or unbearable suffering. The organization that I now work with, My Death, My Decision, says, we believe medically assisted dying should be available for all mentally competent adults with incurable health problems that reduce their quality of life permanently below the level that they feel able to accept. And Humanists UK also have as their current position, we do not think that there's a strong moral case to limit assistance to terminally ill people alone, and we wish to see reform of the law that will be responsive to the needs of other people who have permanent and incurable suffering. So I will close by simply quoting from the European Court of Human Rights, a statement they made in 2002 about Diane Pretty. Remember Diane Pretty, who had motor neuron disease? And the European Court said, quote, "In an era of growing medical sophistication, combined with longer life expectancies, many people are concerned that they should not be forced to linger on into old age or into states of advanced physical or mental decrepitude which conflict with strongly held ideas of self and personal identity." Thank you very much.